Hello and welcome back to What Just Happened. My name is Samuel McVicar, and today we are going to discuss the recent peace agreement between Iran and the U.S. that was announced at the start of the week. I'm joined today by Lead America's analyst Louis Galvin and Principal Middle East and Africa analyst Megan Sutcliffe, who just appeared on the BBC. Well done, Megan. Last time both of you were on the podcast was, I believe, the start of March. We were discussing the opening salvo of this conflict. So it's great to have you both back on just a few short months later for what could potentially be the end. We'll see. Thank you both for joining me today. Okay, so let's start with Megan. Can you just run us through the scope of the deal itself? How much of the deal is public? Are there any specifics that are public? And does anything really notable stand out right away?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now we don't have the exact text of the agreement that has been reached between the United States and Iran because it hasn't been publicly disclosed. However, we can piece together several statements from US President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and various other figures and media outlets in the region. And so we do generally know the general principles that this agreement is centered around. The first is, of course, its nature. Now, many have reported that essentially this agreement is possibly a page, maybe a page and a half, and is in the style of a memorandum of understanding, as opposed to a broader, more comprehensive peace agreement between the US and Iran. The core tenets of this agreement are that the current ceasefire within the Middle East between the US and Iran would be extended by another 60 days, and that during that time, the US and Iran would engage in nuclear negotiations aiming to reach an agreement within that period. In conjunction to that, the Strait of Hormuz would reopen to shipping without tolls, and the US would lift its blockade of Iranian ports. Finally, another aspect of this agreement is, of course, the idea of sanctions relief and the release of frozen assets. Now, we don't know exactly what the US and Iran have agreed to in principle here, because both parties have released different statements about this. But generally speaking, it's understood that the debates are centering over the release of approximately $24 billion worth of frozen Iranian assets, center on the potential relaxation or pausing of US primary and secondary sanctions on Iran, and that there have been discussions about the formation of a reconstruction fund for Iran, with some estimates indicating that it reaches up to $300 billion US. That's a lot to fit into a page and a half of bullet points. So it really is quite the agreement. And it has yet to be signed. It's going to be signed in person in Switzerland on Friday. But generally speaking, it is a major step forward when it comes to the stability of the region. And it gives us a lot to work with when it comes to understanding the dynamics between the US and Iran at this point in time.
I want to ask this to both of you. Knee-jerk reaction, is this a genuine diplomatic breakthrough, or is it more just sort of a pause in hostilities? Do you think this will last? Let's start with you, Megan.
Well, I think that this particular agreement in its current form is likely to come into force and will likely last throughout its term. But that's only because it is a 60-day agreement. It is essentially 2 months. And while it is possible, we're assessing that there's a realistic possibility of there essentially being a rollover, that it continues to extend in 60-day increments until potentially the end of the year. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to transform or result in a broader or more comprehensive agreement between the US and Iran. Rather, our assessment is that actually, because of the complexity of nuclear negotiations and because of the track record of failure of these negotiations to trigger a resounding breakthrough in the region, it's unlikely that we're going to see that occurring within 60 days. And therefore, this idea that this will serve as a bridge into a more comprehensive agreement, that's really what I would take issue with here.
Louis, anything to add? Do you think this is a breakthrough? Trump certainly seems to think it is.
Yeah, I fully agree with Megan's assessment on the agreement. I think at the moment it feels like we're kind of in a holding pattern. It's more of a cessation of hostilities, although we already had the ceasefire in place. It feels like this is a temporary pause to the conflict, at least for 60 days, rather than a genuine diplomatic breakthrough. And I think that's because ultimately it appears that nothing has fundamentally been agreed. In particular, the US's stated aims at the beginning of the war, they have shifted quite substantially. And I think a lot of this now hinges on that nuclear element, which, as Megan has pointed out, is a very complex topic and a very difficult thing for the US and Iran to negotiate. And I think, within this 60-day period, it's going to be very difficult for them to come to an agreement on that. So at the moment, I'm seeing it as more of a little bit of a holding pattern, probably something that will last at least for the 60 days and potentially beyond. But it's really just kind of the framework to really kickstart more official and formal negotiations.
So as I said, Lewis, Trump is claiming a victory out of this, of course, but I'm wondering if there's anything else you think the administration might gain out of this domestically or internationally. I know when you were last on the pod, we were talking about how this war was beginning as midterm season was kind of ramping up. Here we are, November's right around the corner. Do you think this will impact the midterms in a pretty substantial way?
So I think Trump is, of course, claiming this as a victory, but I think what the US actually has to gain from this is more, I think, a bit of a sigh of relief around the world if the Strait of Hormuz does reopen. And if we do get the economic situation stabilizing, I think it's more of respite rather than a gain. But of course, that's relative. It's a gain compared to a month ago, perhaps not a gain compared to January this year, for example. And I think domestically, the pressure is, of course, starting to ramp up. As you pointed out, the US midterms are approaching. Trump has been quite clear that the midterms aren't so much a priority for him, but of course the people around him, the Republican Party, are viewing the midterms as a bit of a litmus test for the administration, which will fundamentally feed into implications for the 2028 presidential election as well. So I think domestically, it's a gain in terms of we can take a pause, we can take a step back, and the US administration can kind of reorient itself ahead of the midterms. And then on the international stage, I think very similar. I think US allies will be praising this as an agreement, but again, probably more in the context of, okay, we can take stock of the situation. Hopefully the global economic situation stabilizes as well, rather than actually the US has made meaningful gains vis-a-vis Iran.
And then Megan, same kind of question to you. How is this being framed inside Iran? And do you think Iran's position has materially improved as a result of this deal, if it goes through?
Well, within Iran, of course, it is quite a complex media landscape, let's say. Freedom of expression is not exactly something that we find within Iran's press environment. However, generally speaking, there have been three primary approaches to the way that this deal has been negotiated. The first is what we're seeing from state-affiliated media, which is generally quite supportive, indicating that there is an interest within Iran's strategic decision-making bodies, and particularly within the IRGC's more rationalist camps, to secure this agreement and to moderate the risk of conflict re-escalation, at least in the short term. That being said, though, that doesn't necessarily mean that every aspect of the IRGC or indeed Iran's political spectrum is behind this deal. We've seen several ultra-conservatives and real hardliners mobilizing media outlets and protesters to oppose this agreement, primarily based on concerns regarding what exactly it means for Iran's nuclear program. Now, we've spoken about this before on several podcasts, but Iran, of course, views its nuclear program as being quite central to its autonomy as a state, and that in order to be central to that autonomy, it has to have a degree of autonomy itself, and therefore commitments by Iran to not develop a nuclear weapon, to potentially accept caps on enrichment, or play ball with the United States from their negotiating positions. There are some within Iran's political spectrum who view that as undermining the autonomy of the nuclear program, and therefore of Iran itself. So there has been some limited opposition. However, that's not necessarily been detrimental to the decision-making process here, and it's not something that we are expecting to undermine the signing process on Friday. The third narrative thread that we're seeing within Iran's press environment is something that's relatively typical of Iranian media when it comes to engagement with the United States, which is essentially leaning into information and messaging campaigns when it comes to the exact details of this deal or of any deal that is potentially being considered. We've seen several state and IRGC affiliated media outlets like Mehr and Tasnim essentially indicating that this agreement is a major breakthrough for Iran and that it includes clauses such as the immediate release of $24 billion. It has included commitments from the United States to withdraw its troops from around Iran, and that it also, of course, would establish this $300 billion reconstruction fund that Iran can immediately access. It's unlikely that those are true. Rather, this is likely Iran's effort to message internally to its population to demonstrate that there have been demonstrable wins from the conflict, but also it's likely part of Iran's negotiating strategy, essentially matching Trump at his own game when it comes to brinkmanship, asserting that these are the terms of the deal that have been agreed and therefore it would just be easier to consent to them. It's unlikely that's going to work, and it's possible that that will actually delay the signing of this agreement, particularly given disputes regarding its more fine terms. But at the same time, it's unlikely that that's going to be utterly detrimental. Broadly speaking, Iran is behind this deal and will likely sign it, depending on the exact clauses that is put towards.
Thanks, Megan. You mentioned the IRGC, and I did want to ask you about it, and now's a good time. What's their status lately? And can you give us a little more insight on how this deal might impact them as an organization? You have covered the IRGC many times on this podcast. I know that their capacity was quite reduced throughout the war. Where are they at, and how might they come out the other side of this deal if it is signed in Switzerland?
You're absolutely right that there has been an impact on the IRGC as a result of this conflict. Of course, in the early days of the war, we saw numerous IRGC commanders being successfully targeted by Israeli and American airstrikes. We saw the routine targeting of ballistic missile launchers, of ballistic missile production facilities and storage facilities. We also saw strikes really engaging in a lot of the IRGC's naval capabilities, so targeting port facilities in Bandar Abbas, targeting its more conventional vessels, as well as its broader military industrial complex. So there has been a demonstrable impact on their capabilities. However, there are two things that are also worth noting that are essentially counterbalances to that. The first is that many speculated when the war began that there would be a breakdown in the command and control of the IRGC, and that it would be operating as these sort of centralized nodes throughout Iran without central guidance. That hasn't necessarily been the case. Rather, we did see the siloing of IRGC command structures and them operating with a degree of autonomy, but that didn't mean that there was a breakdown in their command and control communication lines. Rather, it indicated that it was a more resilient force that was putting into practice the Mosaic defense doctrine that was developed over 20 years ago within Iran's security forces. The second counterbalance is, of course, that Iran's military-industrial complex was born out of the hostility that Iran was facing in international markets during major sanctions and during major financial pressures that limited access to conventional materials, systems, and trading partners. And so it is a system that has a built-in degree of resilience, and one that is based around the idea that a military is most effective when it can cheaply and quickly replace any destroyed capabilities. That's exactly what we've seen Iran and the IRGC doing in the past month and a half when we have had a ceasefire being in force to a greater or lesser extent, at least over the past few weeks. So there has been an impact to the IRGC's capacity, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that that is a critical impact or one that fundamentally undermines their power. There's also another aspect to consider here, which is that throughout the course of this conflict, we have also seen the IRGC consolidating control of the key strategic decision-making bodies within Iran. And this was most clearly demonstrated with the appointment of the deceased Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, as the Supreme Leader. He's an individual who is understood to essentially be the IRGC's candidate. He's one who has maintained very close relations with the military over the past few decades. And at the moment, it would appear that the commander-in-chief of the IRGC, whose last name is Vaidi, has essentially been able to be the one who communicates between Iran's strategic decision-making bodies and the Supreme Leader while he is reportedly still in hospital. The IRGC now wields effectively unprecedented influence, and there are some who characterize this as almost an institutional coup on the part of the IRGC. So while there has been a damage to their hard military capabilities, firstly, the IRGC is resilient, and secondly, it has been able to center itself in Iran's decision-making structures, meaning that going forward, its power is not just going to be limited to foreign and security policy, it's going to have far more influence over the way that Iran operates as a state in all forms.
Thanks, Megan. That's really interesting. Going to flip over to Israel. Lewis, some Israeli politicians have reacted quite negatively to the announcement of this peace agreement. There's concerns that Washington's priorities might be shifting from confrontation with Iran to more accommodation. Do you think there's any weight to those concerns?
Absolutely. But I think it would be a surprise if Israeli politicians have been caught cold by this. I think it's been quite clear for a while now that the US has been seeking an off-ramp to the conflict, and I don't think that's really news. But I think the issue probably comes with where this reported memorandum of understanding has landed. Because I think if we look at what the stated goals were at the start of the conflict, where the US and Israel were largely aligned, the US hasn't really made a lot of meaningful gains in most of these areas. And with the MOU that we're looking at, again, it doesn't look like they're making tangible progress. So among those aims, of course, at the beginning of the conflict, the US set out that it wanted to erode Iran's missile and drone capabilities. Now, of course, those stockpiles are likely to have been depleted. We have seen an active conflict, but not depleted to the point in which Iran doesn't still have those capabilities, or at least the ability to rebuild them. And then elsewhere, we're looking at the proxies as well. This was another key issue the US and Israel wanted to address. And in fact, has been one of the primary sticking points and points of contention, I think, between Washington and the Israeli government over the inclusion of Hezbollah and Lebanon in this memorandum of understanding as well. Regime change, that was the headliner, wasn't it, when this conflict erupted? And I'm sure something that, again, both the US and Israel were pursuing. It became apparent, I think, quite quickly that wasn't going to come to fruition. And again, it's not something that really comes up in this memorandum of understanding as we know it. And then finally, we do have, I think, one point where some gains have been made, and that is just eroding Iran's military capabilities, mostly naval assets. But as the war has unfolded and developed, we've seen that actually that wasn't an area that Iran was leaning on too heavily in the conflict. We've seen, the de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz without those naval assets, and more through, the threat of drones, etc. So I think compared to the day one goals, the almost lack of progress that the US has been able to make, and where we've ended up with this memorandum of understanding on all of those key points, I think are what have driven concerns amongst some Israeli politicians, and I'm sure some US politicians as well, about actually how much progress has the US made in, mitigating the perceived Iranian threat.
Thanks, Lewis. Just a couple more questions here for you guys. This one I want to ask both of you. You've described the current agreement is essentially a 60-day extension tied to future negotiations and the signing of the document itself, as Lewis mentioned, will be taking place in Switzerland. What are the most likely flashpoints, if any, that could derail the process? Let's start with Lewis.
I think from the US side, because the narrative has shifted from those goals that I've just talked about to really hinging on the nuclear element, I think the final area that the US is likely to remain quite steadfast on, because we're no longer really talking about the missiles and the drones. We're no longer really talking about the proxies as much from the US perspective. We are really talking about the nuclear element. So I think if it becomes quite apparent that no negotiations or no agreement can be reached on either diluting, destroying, or removing Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, or at least curbing Iran's enrichment capabilities, I think that's the main flashpoint that could see Washington DC take issue with how negotiations are going and be a potential re-escalation point.
Megan, anything on the Iran side that could derail the process?
There are many things that could potentially derail this process, but to narrow it down, firstly, I'd certainly agree with what Lewis has said about the nuclear program. From Iran's point of view, there needs to be more flexibility from the US's negotiating positions. If that is not forthcoming, then I doubt that engagement will be productive. And if engagement is not productive, deadlock will likely come in. And we've been in that situation twice before, both of which times, of course, we then saw a war emerging, firstly between Israel and Iran, and secondly between the US, Israel, and Iran. The second area that's likely going to be very contentious is Lebanon. Now, that's a whole other issue, possibly for another podcast sometime. But generally speaking, Iran views the ceasefire between the US and Iran as also including Lebanon, whereby Israel is engaged in combat with Lebanese Hezbollah, even though, technically speaking, there is still a ceasefire in place within Lebanon. It's a relatively complex scenario, but in general, Iran views it as a necessity that there is a universal ceasefire within Lebanon in order to de-escalate the conflict between Israel and Lebanese Hezbollah. Pakistani mediators have said that their understanding is that the ceasefire would also apply in Lebanon. However, US officials briefing the BBC and various other news outlets have said that while there would be a ceasefire in Lebanon, Israel would be able to maintain its positions in southern Lebanon and maintain operational freedom. That's something that we've also seen Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz saying as well. And so these divergent understandings of what exactly a ceasefire means, particularly with reference to Lebanon, that could be particularly destabilizing. And of course, we've seen Donald Trump making several comments at the G7 summit regarding his concerns as to what exactly Israel's operations in Lebanon seek to do and what they will have as an impact on the US and Iran's negotiations. The final area that is of concern is also going to be the Strait of Hormuz. Now, of course, nominally, our understanding is that this memorandum of understanding would reopen the waterway. And this was something that Trump emphasized in his post on Truth Social when he announced the agreement, that essentially vessels should start their engines because they're about to be able to move through the waterway that has been under a de facto closure for over 3 months.
Thanks, Megan. I'm glad you brought up the Strait. So your report points out something very important. Obviously, markets reacted pretty much immediately to the reopening or the potential reopening of the Strait. But the report from your desk notes that it will take some time to get things up and running, certainly back to the pre-war status of the Strait. Can you just explain why that's particularly difficult to do?
Absolutely. Now, I will preface this by saying I am not a seafarer, and so I do apologise to all those who are currently stuck in the Strait of Hormuz. It likely is very frustrating to have so many people talking about your predicament while they are not actually there. However, generally speaking, when it comes to the resumption of pre-conflict activity through the Strait of Hormuz, there are several barriers to this that will likely delay that resumption. The first is, of course, security concerns. Throughout the conflict, there were allegations and concerns that Iran had deployed sea mines into the Strait of Hormuz. And even though it's possible that there aren't actually any sea mines there, there are going to have to be demining operations through the waterway in order to reassure vessel operators and insurers that it is indeed safe to send their vessels through the waterway. That could take several weeks, could be quite short if there are no sea mines, slightly longer if there are. So that's one of the roadblocks. The second is, of course, the logistical roadblock. We've had hundreds of vessels stuck in the Persian Gulf for months now, and so clearing that backlog is going to take time, particularly if we're accounting for the maintenance that those vessels are likely going to need after having been stuck and not moving, acquiring things like barnacles and algae that mean they can't operate properly. That maintenance takes time. And the other side of the coin is also that global supply chains have adapted to the new normal with the Strait of Hormuz. They've rerouted their supply chains and sent vessels elsewhere. Readjusting those supply chains takes time because many of these vessels essentially move at the pace of a person on a bicycle. You can't immediately pick them up from one port and put them back into the Persian Gulf. So it will likely take several weeks for that to readjust as well in a best case scenario. The final concern is one relating to compliance and costs. Now, at the moment, insurance providers are still levying war risk premiums on vessels that are moored in the Persian Gulf and that want to move through the Strait of Hormuz. But different insurance markets are reacting differently to these developments that we're seeing in the Middle East. And that's led some, like the head of Lloyd's List Intelligence, to characterize insurance markets as operating without a center of gravity at the moment. That price variability and the difference in coverage means that the financial viability of routinely transiting the strait at this point in time is not necessarily going to be equal for all vessel operators, and that again will contribute to this broader disruption of shipping markets. And that's before we even get to the question of whether or not Iran is able to regulate the movement of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the US has said that Iran will not be able to levy tolls on vessels moving through the waterway. Iran has said that vessels will only be able to move under Iranian jurisdiction. Now, it's possible that in this 60-day ceasefire period, we will see Iran simply requesting information from vessels and not necessarily levying tolls. It is possible they would also try to levy service charges, which seem like exactly the same thing, but legally speaking are slightly different. That will be a concern for vessel operators, particularly Western vessel operators, because the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the body that Iran set up in early May to regulate the Strait of Hormuz, has been sanctioned by the United States. So paying money to that entity would violate US sanctions, which is, of course, an illegal nightmare for entities that are based in the United States, trade through major financial centers like New York, and therefore is something that's going to add to that kind of chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz at this point in time. Taking all of those factors into consideration, it's likely going to be months before we see pre-conflict maritime activity resuming in the Gulf. And so the knock-on effects for supply chains, for the availability of things like oil, gas, helium, and industrial gases, that's going to be particularly challenging.
Last question to you both, slightly different type of closing question. You both spend your careers studying very different parts of the world. I wanted to ask what one thing about this agreement you think that the media, the public, pundits, policymakers are currently getting wrong. Let's start with the America side. Lewis.
That is a fantastic question. So I think as someone who spends a lot of time looking at US foreign policy more broadly, I think it's not necessarily what pundits and media are getting wrong about just the agreement in isolation, but really about the kind of drivers that have led us to this point where we appear to be faced with a memorandum of understanding that really doesn't address a lot of those US goals. On one hand, it is almost the pragmatic element from the US of realizing they couldn't achieve those goals. But I think more broadly, it ties into the bigger picture of US foreign policy. And this is something that I don't think is being discussed or looked at enough. And that is the prospect of what is now a second-term president, only having 2.5 years left in office, wanting to cement a legacy. And that is something that Trump himself has set out and announced that he wants to do. And I think I'm looking at this more broadly on that global scale. And I'm looking at the prospect of this administration leaving with the Chavistas gone in Venezuela. And we're hearing a lot about the removal of the Communist Party in Cuba. And of course, the initial plan in Iran appeared to be one of regime change. And I think that prospect of Trump leaving office with less adversaries or traditional adversaries facing the US, so countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran, with complete shifts in their governance structure and the threat level that they pose to the US. I think that is really an area that Trump is looking at quite heavily, and I think that's also part of the reason why we appear on the path to putting this conflict to bed. Of course, we still have those potential re-escalation points, but I think it's possibly time for the US to start looking at, or they will want to start looking at, other theaters and other potential areas of opportunity as well.
I'd certainly agree with what Lewis has said. Trump is certainly looking for a legacy, and that certainly puts a different aspect or a different light onto some of his foreign policy decisions over the past few months. Generally speaking, though, I think that after several years of observing the way that Trump speaks to mediators or to the media, or indeed to other foreign leaders, increasingly it's become clear that while we should take Trump seriously, we should not take him literally. And I think that is one thing that possibly certain media outlets sometimes struggle with, because there is a real desire to try and understand exactly what Trump has said at any given point in time, give that airtime and try and figure it out. But then we will almost instantaneously see a Trump pivot. We've seen that in the Middle East many times. It was very prolific, for example, in the early days of his second term, when we saw him saying that the United States would take control of Gaza. This was taken very, very literally, but then it seems to have completely dissipated and disappeared. And so I think that that's one aspect, particularly when it comes to Iran and to the relationship with Israel, that it's important to remember that Trump is very serious, but he's not necessarily literal. Understanding what he says through that paradigm is key to seeing what his next few steps are going to be.
Well, thank you very much, Megan and Lewis. If listeners are interested, we didn't get to everything. There's so much to unpack here. As Megan said, there's a whole situation with Lebanon. We left out Pakistan, sanctions relief, other sectors like tourism, aerospace, finance, tech. You can read about all of that in the Middle East Crisis Update, which is published every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We also have regular briefings that you can sign up for. The links for all of this will be in the description down below. Those briefings happen every Thursday. Until next time, take care.